Zanker-Rivera. You want to wave out there? Wave, Stephanie. There she is. She is a Behavioral Health Clinical Supervisor with the Office of the Commissioner, Young Adult Services, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. She has 30+ years working with children, adolescents, young adults, families, in both the private and public sector in various settings, including outpatient, inpatient, and congregate settings. In her current role, she is responsible for administrative and clinical oversight of several YAS programs across the state and manages transitions of youth from Department of Children and Family Services to Young Adult Services. Ms. Zanker-Rivera is also the Director of Prevention and Parenting for YAS and oversees a team of perinatal support specialists and doulas who provide perinatal birth support, as well as prevention and parenting education for clients, and has presented to programs on outcomes to these two international conferences. She is also the YAS Liaison to the Department of Corrections, and she participates in several statewide committees, including Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team, which is commonly referred to as HART. So welcome, Stephanie. Our second presenter is Ellen Whelan. Ellen's up, well, I see her on my left corner, but Ellen Whelan. Hello there, Ellen. Dr. Ellen Whelan is the supervising psychologist at the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services Waterbury Young Adult Services Program. And for the past 15 years, she has worked with the Department of Children and Youth Services in their central office, as well as the Albert Solnick Children's Center Hospital and Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility in Middletown. She's a certified trainer in Introduction to Child Sex Trafficking in Connecticut and in Implicit Bias. Dr. Whelan attained full certification as a clinician and supervisor in adolescent community reinforcement approach, ARC, and is intensively trained in dialectical behavior. I welcome both of you to present today.
Thank you, Colette. So I can't remember. Okay, there, Dr. Whelan has the. So good morning, everybody. We're so excited to be here, Dr. Whelan and I, to provide the training on human trafficking. As Colette mentioned, we are both certified trainers through the DCF Introduction to Child Trafficking training, which is a separate kind of 2-hour training. But we have utilized some of the slides from that training, so we did want to give credit, and we have the permission of Tammy Sneed to do that. So welcome.
Good morning. Sorry, I had a little trouble signing in.
No worries.
Thank you, though, for having me.
Okay, so first thing, we want to just encourage folks, right? We're going to be talking about some potentially difficult material, human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking. So please just be sure to take care of yourself. If the information is kind of sensitive or you're having a reaction, feel free to take a break, not a problem. So just take care. Real quick, just a quick energy check, right? Check in with yourself. Are you feeling kind of hyper aroused this morning? Maybe, getting the kids on the bus, the dog, you dropped your coffee. If so, maybe just take a second round, take a deep breath. Perhaps you're feeling a little hypo aroused. You didn't sleep well, you're tired. Maybe a glass of cold water, move your body a little bit, just kind of check. We want to kind of get you in that window of tolerance where you're sort of alert, you're receptive to kind of taking in the information and hearing what's presented. So that's it. The agenda for today, first part I'm going to cover most of it. We're going to talk about types of trafficking, which include labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And I'll cover a little bit about who are the victims and some red flags. And then Dr. Whelan will kind of segue into part 2, talking about the impact of child trafficking, prevention, and intervention. We've really shrunk it. The intro to trafficking training also talks about kind of who are the perpetrators, the traffickers, who are the buyers. That's a whole other training, so we won't kind of go there today. All right, so the AMP model, action, means, purpose, is a conceptual model to explain the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA, which is federal legislation. And it defines trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act or labor services that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And I'll talk a little bit more about force, fraud, and coercion in a bit. But in which the person is induced to perform such acts and has not obtained 18 years of age. And again, I'm going to define child trafficking versus adult in a bit, but that's the AMK model. So victims of trafficking, I mean, many of you are probably aware of the power and control wheel for folks, victims of intimate partner violence. And victims of trafficking are often subject to the same kinds of abuse as are battered women and children. So they may have restrictions on their freedom of movement, isolation, financial control, threats, intimidation, physical and sexual violence, and the fostering of drug and alcohol dependence due to their situation. So I'm not going to go through the entire wheel, but feel free to peruse that later. So human trafficking, by the numbers, it is the second largest and fastest growing criminal enterprise, and human trafficking generates $150 billion per year. I'm just curious why folks think so. It actually has already surpassed weapons in terms of growing criminal enterprise, and it's anticipated to surpass drug trafficking. And I'm curious, and you can feel free to put it in the chat room, why folks think it might, it's anticipated to surpass, why it might become the #1 criminal enterprise. Just curious if, I'll give it a quick second, but if not, I'm going to go ahead and give the answer just for purposes of time. Basically, when you sell a weapon, you're selling the weapon one time. You're making a profit off one sale. Drugs, same thing. You're selling the substance one time. With humans, you can sell the product over and over and over, multiple times, and continue to make money off of that. So that's the reason. And just, by the way, I don't remember if I said this, we're going to hold questions to the end. If I didn't say that, I think I did. All right, so we're going to start with labor trafficking. Just a quote here. So she promised me work and then forced me to give up my passport and my wages. All right, so types of labor trafficking. First one is bonded labor or debt bondage. It's the most widely used method. Victims become bonded laborers when their labor is demanded as a means of repayment for a loan or service. So usually you're working to repay a loan for shelter, transportation, something like that. And these schemes are organized in ways that the individual is constantly accruing new debt, and there's just never any way to pay it off. They're indebted. Forced labor, victims are forced to work against their will under the threat of violence or some sort of punishment. Their freedom may be restricted, and there's degrees of ownership. Child labor is where children work in areas that are likely hazardous to their health, physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development, and it often interferes with their education. And so child labor, it's basically any child under the age of 16 that's working, and for those between 16 and 18, working again in ways that are not in compliance with Department of Labor. So labor trafficking red flags. I'm not necessarily going to go through every one of these, but these are things to look for, right? So someone who may not be in control of their money or have identity documents. They might be living at the place of employment. Poor living conditions, maybe submissive or fearful. They might have an inability to speak or to speak alone. There might be someone always with them where they're not able to speak freely. Unpaid or very little pay for the job, overly concerned with pleasing others. So again, just some red flags. One thing to keep in mind that if you suspect a child is a victim, either they report it or you suspect it of labor trafficking, as mandated reporters, we need to report that to the DCF care line And I believe we have a slide later with that number. But you may also have a child that, talks to their teacher about their parent situation, and it sort of raises some red flags that the parent might be a victim of labor trafficking. In that case, absolutely, you should go ahead and call either your local police department or the Department of Labor. So vulnerable populations are purposely targeted by traffickers, right? They're targeting the most vulnerable people, which include people that are typically on the fringes of society, often not noticed or overlooked. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are 24.9 million people internationally trapped in forced labor, and this includes domestic-born children. Some vulnerabilities, as I alluded to, include poverty, isolation, substance use, lack of stable relationships, lack of labor protection, language barriers, lack of knowledge of their rights, barriers to education, and lack of support systems. So where does labor trafficking happen? It happens in a lot of places, and the places of employment in red are ones that were found actually here in Connecticut, and it's probably growing since this slide was created. But just to name some, and some may not be surprising, some may be. So massage, health, beauty parlors, nail salons, domestic work, bars and strip clubs, traveling sales crew. I remember several years ago, there was a client with Young Adult Services who responded to an online ad for work. And next thing you know, the client was moved off to Ohio, where they became part of a traveling sales crew. I think it was like encyclopedias or something, which I wouldn't think people would want. And it became that indebted, bonded situation. Fortunately, this young adult had the resources to contact us back at YAS, and we were able to get the client back. But just responding to an ad for what appeared to be a great job, too good to be true. By the way, you're going to see these barcodes throughout these Scan Me, and they come from, again, the HART presentation, and you can certainly feel free to scan those to get additional information. So human trafficking, he lied about the job, and now he won't let me leave. Keep in mind, that job may be in the sex industry. So someone could be forced to work in the sex industry, and therefore it's labor and sex trafficking. If they're not mutually exclusive, there can be many victims that are subjected to labor and sex trafficking. All right, so now we're going to go on to talk about sex trafficking specifically. I'm going to start with child sex trafficking. So child sex trafficking is, or it's also known as domestic minor sex trafficking, DMST. So it's defined as obtaining a child, someone under the age of 18, for a commercial sex act or any sex act in exchange for something of value. So obviously money, it doesn't have to be just money, anything of value, food, housing, clothing, drugs, anything of value. It does not require a third party. The trafficker may be the buyer. And it does not have to involve force, fraud, or coercion, which again, I will get to. For adult victims, well, I'll put that off, but I did want to just kind of get back quickly to labor trafficking. With labor trafficking, the victim always has to prove whether it's an adult or a child. There has to be proof of force, fraud, or coercion for all labor trafficking. For child sex trafficking, never. It does not have to be proved. A child is never able to consent. Children can never be charged or prosecuted. This is never prostitution, and children are always, always victims. So this, I remember this slide when I became a certified trainer many, many years ago. For some reason, this slide stood out to me, and it really put it into perspective. So this is a Connecticut case, a real case of a minor who was a victim of sex trafficking. So in over 315 days, she was with about 20 buyers per night, right? And often trafficking victims have a nightly quota that they have to meet. So she had to meet a quota of $1,000 a night. And again, that came to about 20 buyers per night over 315 days. So that means she was sexually assaulted as a minor, she cannot consent, 6,300 times, totaling $315,000. The trafficker made $315,000 tax-free. She didn't see a dime of it, right? So just think about that. That's just one case and how many times this is happening nationally. Individuals in our community are profiting from the sale of children. So is all prostitution over the age of 18 sex trafficking? No, not necessarily, right? So first, with adults, trafficking must involve a third-party beneficiary, meaning someone else besides the buyer or the person receiving the sexual act must be involved. And this is often a trafficker, a boyfriend, a friend, a family member. And secondly, with adults, human sex trafficking, when involving adults over the age of 18, is achieved through force, fraud, or coercion. Again, that has to be proved. Okay, so force, fraud, coercion. What is it? So in reality, force, fraud, and coercion takes many different forms. It rarely involves handcuffing victims to a bedpost as some kind of envision. I think that's sort of what folks think of when they think of sex trafficking. Force, it may include physical restraint, physical harm, sexual assault, beatings. Monitoring and confinement are often used to control the victims, especially during early stages of victimization. Fraud is a broken promise, right? The promise of a better life, a safe place to live, a loving relationship. It's that, we'll get to this a little bit, that sort of grooming. Coercion, it can be highly addictive drugs, threats of harm to a victim or their family, blackmail or threats to release intimate photos of the victim. So these are different force, fraud, and coercion defined. All right, it's a little quiz. Is sex trafficking or not? We have three scenarios, right? So maybe just a show of hands real quickly in response to this. But if a boyfriend or a husband tells his adult partner that he will post intimate photos unless the partner performs sex acts for money, how many people think, show of hands, think this is an example of sex trafficking? And actually, I probably won't be able to see a lot of the hands. Yeah, can't. Okay. You want to click, Ellen?
There's like 7 raised hands. It's going up.
There's 7 what?
Raised hands, 10 raised.
Okay. Okay. So those of you that raise your hands, and thank you for that. This is sex trafficking. There is, it's an adult, but there is a third party, and there is coercion here. Okay, another one. Is this sex trafficking or not? If an adult posts an ad for sex in return for money by his or her own volition, and a person pays for and receives sexual acts as a result, show of hands if you think this is sex trafficking. I see some heads saying no, so, but I'm. Okay. Do we want to show it, Ellen? All right, yeah, that is not sex trafficking, right? That is a person who is over the age of 18, able to consent, making a decision to exchange a sex act directly in exchange for something of value. All right, last one. If a 16-year-old runs away from home and meets a new friend who encourages him or her to make money by selling sexual favors, show of hands if you think it is trafficking. Okay. 2 participants, 3. Oh, I can see that now. 4, 5. Okay. All right. Dr. Whelan, do you want to show? Okay. So, yep, this is sex trafficking. This person is under the age of 18, 16-year-old, 100%. This is trafficking. All right. Types of sex trafficking. First one, bold, italicized, underlined. I'm going to get back to that in a minute because not surprisingly, that's the number one entree. But these are some other areas. Street, soliciting someone on the street. That's less and less the case these days, only because it really would raise awareness, right? If a trafficker is selling someone who looks fairly young on the street, it would raise into question and potentially increase the likelihood of that person being arrested. Stripping or dancing, that's a common area. That's often a way of kind of segueing into the life. Folks, young girls might get lured to dance at a strip club, and next thing you know, they're kind of being told to go to the back room, and then from there, it's being forced to provide sex acts. Child sexual abuse images, escort services, casinos and clubs. You know, we have a couple of casinos here and right over the border. That's an area where people are lured. Private parties, high school parties. This is becoming an increasing trend, right? So high school folks saying to their, someone saying to their buddies, hey, if you bring a 6-pack of beer, my partner will perform sex acts on you. Interfamilial, this does happen. Parents trafficking their own children. Forced marriage, survival sex, so ways to get your basic needs met. And this is probably more common amongst homeless folks. Sex for substances, gang-based, sextortion. It's becoming more popular where someone gets a young person to send naked photos, inappropriate photos, and next thing you know, they're demanding more and more photos, and if not, threatens to expose this young person, their friends, their family. Internet-based, I did want to just quickly talk about that, right? So this is the most prevalent form, not surprisingly. The vast majority of youth have technology and they're on it daily, right? And they're letting strangers into their lives daily. This can include social media. This can include dating apps, chat rooms. Again, as I mentioned before, fake job opportunities. Big one to keep in mind is gaming. So gaming is becoming huge. 1.2 billion people game globally. 91% of kids between the ages of 12 and 17, and I'll say my kids, have done some gaming. That's about 64 million children worldwide who are gamers. Think about the opportunity for predators there, right? And they get into Discord as a gaming site, but that's a real open door for predators. So how do people become victims? There's really no clear profile, although certain populations are more vulnerable. Anyone, regardless of race, age, gender, sexual preference, SES, can be a victim. Youth who run away or forced out of a home by a caregiver, gang affiliation, involvement in child protection, foster care, juvenile justice, and certainly the LGBTQ+ population. And Dr. Whelan will certainly talk much more about this. So grooming behaviors by traffickers, right? So they specifically target the victim, and the grooming process is designed to gain the trust, meet the needs. So they're going to use manipulative practices, often convincing the victim that they care about them, right? I love you so much, you're my boo, like, will you be my girlfriend or boyfriend? They're masters at identifying vulnerable youth and identifying and exploiting their vulnerabilities. And once seduced, the traffickers use physical and psychological torture to control the victims. And these tactics lead to complete obedience and a breakdown of personal autonomy. And the goal is to really kind of manipulate the victims to the point that they become complicit in not complicit, but that they assist in their own trafficking. And it's used to increase glamorization of the pimping, I'm having a hard time talking, pimping and hoe culture, as well as cultural acceptance of the demand for child victims. Some recruitment techniques, again, appealing to promises of a better life angling to fulfill a relationship that is lacking. You know, often these victims, these kiddos, you know, they don't have supportive, loving relationships, and the traffickers prey on that. Meeting their basic needs, such as food, shelter, clothing, using peers or other victims to lure them, utilizing manipulation, you know, sense of duty, you know, you need to help your family, exploiting financial needs and debts, enticing them through internet chat rooms, as I mentioned, and using violence, threat, and force. So how to identify potential victims? There's many red flags, but these are just things you all can look for, and we've kind of categorized them. So in terms of physical appearance, you might see a sudden change in how they've been dressing or appear, signs of physical assault, maybe bruises, broken bones. They may have tattoos or branding, poor hygiene, malnourishment. So you might see hair loss, fingernail damage, dental issues, inadequately dressed for the season or the situation, signs of self-harm, recurrent STDs. In terms of behavior, they might miss a lot of school or work, academic decline, homelessness, suicide attempts, drug and alcohol use, uncharacteristically promiscuous behavior. They might present as very fearful, submissive, anxious. In terms of material things to look for, unexplained cash, unexplained clothing, purses, beautiful nails all the time. They may have a second cell phone or multiple cell phones, hotel room keys. Why would a child have hotel room keys? Fake IDs, lots of condoms. And in terms of interactional red flags, surprising change in their relationships and friendships, scripted communication, or the presence of a controlling companion, someone who's always right there kind of controlling things, lack of ID or discrepancy in age, inconsistencies in stories, lack of knowledge, they don't know where they are, using terms that are common with the life, which is referring to child trafficking. So talking about daddy, a date, trick, presence or reference to an older boyfriend, and reference to modeling jobs, music jobs. That's often how they're lured in. So we have two videos in the presentation. This is the first one, which is two adults who were victims of trafficking, kind of sharing their stories and also their resiliency. And again, you know, some of the two videos, they might be upsetting, and certainly, again, feel free to take a break, walk away. So we'll go ahead and show that.
I was trafficked in my early 20s by a man that I really thought cared about me. He abused me, starved me, and then eventually sold me. I think what most people think is once you're away from that abuse, that like things go back to normal, but there really isn't a normal after that.
Rebecca Carey is a survivor of human trafficking. It's considered among the fastest growing criminal industries in the world and affects approximately 25 million people. In the U.S., sex trafficking has been reported in all 50 states, and 1 in 6 runaway children are likely to become a victim.
I ran away for the first time at 11 years old. I was approached very shortly after I ran away by an older woman down the street. She built a relationship with me to the point that I even called her mom. She took me to parties with a lot of older men. I was raped at one of these parties, and she actually celebrated. She told me that she was grateful that was out of the way. She started taking me to parties and forcing me to sleep with men for her drug addiction.
Human trafficking doesn't always involve sex. It can include forced labor, marriage, torture, and sometimes organ removal. It's not like what you see in the movies.
Human trafficking is not like black and white. It is very complex. It's very dark. It's very complicated. But when we say, hey, human trafficking looks like the movie Taken, which is so bad because that's not accurate, then victims who have been trafficked like me, which is the majority, will never self-identify because they think it looks like one thing when it really is so much more than that.
I get really frustrated when a lot of people think, oh, does this really happen here? Yes, it's happening right under your noses. It looks like the addicted mom selling her daughter. It looks like the controlling boyfriend. It's so plain in front of your faces that a lot of people either discount it or they ignore it. which is disturbing.
For Carla and Rebecca, transitioning back into society after their abuse wasn't easy.
The 15 years that I did not self-identify, I was doing things that were putting me on a path for destruction.
I would honestly say relationships were the hardest thing for me to figure out. I always expected someone to want something from me rather than just love me for who I am. I dealt with very, very tormenting memories, and it actually resulted in me attempting to take my own life. That was the day that I tried to throw in the towel, and God threw it in my face and said, "No, girl, you got work to do."
Today, both women have dedicated themselves to helping others with similar experiences adjust to new lives.
Finances is something that we have all struggled with. Coming back into a secure and safe, stable place, and then having to all of a sudden do for yourself. This is something that has never really been taught to me until recently.
There are a lot of obstacles when it comes to survivors and in the workforce, as well as everyday living. And that's why economic empowerment is so important.
In April, the House of Representatives passed a bill to help survivors of human trafficking repair their credit.
This simple 4-page bill has the potential to help thousands of victims every year by ensuring that a consumer reporting agency may not furnish a credit report with adverse information from a severe form of trafficking. While this does not erase the terrible crimes committed against them, it will help victims to regain their financial freedom and begin to rebuild their lives.
Advocates are pushing the Senate to pass the bill too. But in the meantime, some experts think there's more work to be done in the private sector.
The gap that needs to be filled is going to come from businesses, because the tool that businesses have, the thing that they have, the golden ticket they have is a job.
Shannon Deere and Cheryl Miller are co-authors of an upcoming book entitled Business Doing Good. It's their attempt to alert American businesses to the potential benefits of hiring women with challenging pasts.
You can teach all the technical skills in the world, but if you want to hire for resilience and grit, hire women overcomers.
It's the mindsets of some people that think, well, they're not ready for the workforce, or we can't take the risk on these employees. And my response to that is, well, gosh, that's a shame, because these are going to be some of your most valuable employees, because they bring non-traditional skills into the workplace that they've learned by surviving all the things that they've survived.
Miller knows how a job can change a woman's life.
It's impacting generations. It's not only going to change her life, it's going to change her children's life and her grandchildren's life, and it has a really exponential impact.
We're strong, we're resilient. We've survived something that a lot of people couldn't even wrap their minds and their thoughts around. So if I was a business owner, I would want to hire survivors, because that, to me, is giving a survivor another chance, a chance at life, a chance at freedom.
Hey, NBC News viewers.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that very detailed and thorough discussion of the types of trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking, as well as the red flags. Moving forward, I'll talk a bit about who are the victims, the impact of trafficking, prevention and intervention. I do want to make you aware that each of these could probably be their own 2-hour presentation, so they'll just probably feel more like an overview. Really, any child can be a victim of trafficking. There are certain experiences that can increase a trafficking vulnerability, such as prior sexual abuse, physical and emotional abuse, homelessness, poverty, youth with family or friends who have been trafficked, displacement due to war, natural disaster, unstable family conditions or family rejection, as well as low self-esteem or self-worth, which then contribute to other risk factors that further increase vulnerability, such as system involvement, the child welfare system or juvenile justice system, running away or truancy, mental health challenges, substance use, and of course the inherent vulnerability of being a youth and their brains not being fully developed, or even a young adult. The traffickers exploit these vulnerabilities. When we look at these experiences, you may recognize that many of them are adverse childhood experiences. If we know that those who have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are at greater risk of health problems, as well as other life challenges. It's important to note that the children in these groups are at a higher risk, and it's of no fault of their own. It's our culture and our society that causes this. So when we talk a little bit about the impacts, this also impacts our communities, our families, and our various systems. Children with a history of trauma are at a higher risk and are more vulnerable to victimization by child trafficking. When we think about youth in foster care and that have run away or are homeless, identify as LGBTQ+ or LGBTQ2S+, so that's the two-spirit, thinking of our Native American and Alaska Native populations, which is more of a cultural, spiritual significance, that these are the people that have been failed in our society. And so, and our systems, when we look at our systems nationwide and here in Connecticut, they are there's a lot of racial injustice, disparities, and inequities that are throughout our whole system. Even just at the beginning of these systems, when young people first enter these systems, and all throughout the systems. So when we talk about how to address some of these challenges, it's also recognizing some of the racial inequities that need to be addressed in our culture. So that brings me to the intersection of race and trafficking. Why are Black, Indigenous, people of color at a higher risk for victimization? Thinking about historical trauma, so the transatlantic slave trade, intergenerational racism that has resulted in poverty for many folks. We have a long history in our country of systems that have created and maintained people in poverty. So there are certain communities in Connecticut where in the deeds, it wasn't, people of color weren't allowed to purchase the homes. There were a lot of systems that made it very difficult for people to purchase homes who are of color. So, and then we also have our own societal challenges and implicit biases. Some of you may have heard of some of the recent research of one of the articles is Girlhood Interrupted, where they recognize that people often perceive Black youth and then particularly Black boys as older than their actual age. And this is actually by 4.5 years. There are also multiple adverse childhood experiences that may be impacting them, and this is often due to systemic inequities. Black girls are viewed as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, and this especially begins at the age range of 5 through 14. And what that means is that people see Black girls as needing less nurturing, less protection, to be supported less, to be comforted less, to also know more about sex. And you can also imagine how this impacts how trafficked young people of color are treated by our systems, and including the mental health system, when we have these implicit biases. Also, Black, Indigenous, people of color are often seen, and particularly men and boys, are often seen as perpetrators and not victims. We were sold for a certain amount of money for 30 minutes or an hour. Allow me to repeat myself. We were sold. In my case, being a person of color sold by a white person to other white people was painful on multiple levels. It wasn't until my adult years that I was able to process how closely this aligned with racial oppression. I can't compare one victim's experience to another's, but I will say that race can add an additional layer of oppression. And it's so important to think about these, when we think about intergenerational trauma, and also for Black boys, they're also seen as the police violence against them as more justified. So when we look at how these victims are treated in systems once they've been identified, it's often different than their white peers. I would also say that it's so important to consider the oppression and the being culturally responsive to racial oppression when working with survivors of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So LGBTQ2S+ victims, it's an underreported problem. Approximately 40% of our homeless youth are LGBTQ2S+, and they're twice as likely to run from home. And this is often because of their experience of being rejected by family and society. And also about half of transgender and bisexual people have also experienced sexual assault, which we know is an experience that can increase victimization. So because of the shame involved with being sex trafficked, and even society's stereotypes of people who are LGBTQ2S+, maybe more interested in sex or are consenting, that has also impacted their ability to share their experience. Male victims are another underreported problem. Nationally, boys account for 36% of sex traffic victims. In Connecticut, we actually don't see this number, and I would imagine that that is because we aren't identifying them as survivors of sex trafficking. Boys do present differently. That impacts how we're viewed or how they come forward with their experiences. When we are presented with boys, they're more likely to have been considered runaways, and so when people often attribute survivors of sex trafficking as being stolen into this life, where when we look at boys, people of color, it might be thought of as that they're more consenting. Boys also may more likely engage in survival sex, and oftentimes this is not immediately seen as sex trafficking for some, and they're more likely to be charged with a crime, and so not seen as survivors. In terms of their challenges to disclosure, preconceived notions about manhood impact their disclosure. There's thoughts that males should always want sex. We can even see in some of the media reports when a young person is victimized by an adult, that when they often describe them more as lovers rather than being a rape victim. The idea that males can't be victims is another challenge, as well as fear of being labeled gay. As you all likely know, an erection does not equal consent, or this can be quite confusing for survivors. So now I'm going to show you a video about boys in the sex trade. And again, if you need to take some time for yourself, if you need to move around, if the topic feels a little challenging, please be sure to take care of yourself. We're going to talk about this, but it's so important for us to care for ourselves so we can do the work with others.
We have this idea from movies where a young woman is drugged, chained, and then taken to a different country. But what happens in our own neighborhoods, it's more stories like mine of boyfriends who form a connection with you and you trust them. And then you wake up one day and you realize you're being trafficked. I originally grew up in a very small town called Navasota in Texas. I didn't actually come out to my family. My parents went through my cell phone one day. At this time, I'm 15 years old. My father said, I'm only going to ask you one more time, are you gay? And I said, I'm not. And the second I said that to him, I got a fist to my face and I blacked out, hit the floor, and he kicked me into my abdomen. I got up, dialed 911 on our home phone, and he smacked the phone out of my hand. I didn't feel safe. And I remember thinking that if I had a relationship with someone who's older, they'll be able to protect me and they'll be able to give me the support and the love that I haven't been given my entire life. The first night, Jason treated me amazing. We went to lunch, we had dinners, and then the routine changed a little bit. He said, one day you're going to want to live a life on your own, and I think it'd be a great idea if you got a head start. He said, I'm a registered massage therapist. I think it would be great if you gave massages with me. We had our first appointment set. The first thing I noticed is the client has no clothing on and he's not under the sheeting that was provided. And then Jason began to take his clothing off. And I knew I had to take my clothes off. As the massages continued, they began to get more and more aggressive. I remember when things started getting to a point to where I had zero control over what happened to me. I had so many dreams. I had so many goals. There were so many things that I wanted to do. And suddenly I'm in this place where I'm not able to do any of it. Yeah, I'd probably say like half an inch we could take off and it'll be fine. Yeah. Slowly but surely, I started to notice that I had to start taking care of myself. I had to find solid ground because I just felt like I was going to die from this feeling that I had. And I began working out with a trainer. The stronger that my body became, the stronger my mind became. And I slowly started to let go of the anxiety. I am a full-time hairstylist here in Boston, Massachusetts. I finally have a set clientele who love me, who support me, who come and see me once a month. I am also advocating and I'm helping others. When I first started creating content for TikTok, I was terrified of being myself. This is happening all the time. That was pretty good. And that's why I felt that I needed to share my story and I needed to come forward and help as many people as possible.
So what I like about this video is I think it gives us some information of what trafficking could look like that might be different than what we would expect. Mm-hmm. So why do victims stay? We're going back to the power and control wheel that Stephanie had shared with us, right? That's the question for people who have experienced intimate partner violence, right? Why are they staying? And it's for many of the same reasons. And I say looking at the reasons helps us identify what they need in treatment, what they need from us, right? So they may be staying because of fear, maybe their past trauma. They may be feeling this is their only opportunity for survival. The stigma, feeling that they might be judged, maybe there's an addiction that's keeping them that has also been facilitated by the trafficker. There's often a distrust of health providers, government, the police. Oftentimes their previous experiences with these systems have been unhelpful, maybe even problematic, as they've often been seen as perpetrators rather than victims. They may be unaware of what is being done to them as a crime. I had worked with one young lady who was cognitively limited, and she actually didn't even realize she was being trafficked. In her mind, the trafficker was her boyfriend, and the people who were raping her were his friends who were giving her a ride to see her boyfriend. She didn't recognize what was even happening to her. They may develop loyalties, have positive feelings towards the trafficker as a coping mechanism. So this is that trauma bonding. This might be somebody who is likely, if we think about those grooming tactics that Stephanie shared earlier, that they had felt that maybe this person saved them from another challenging situation. They also have been groomed and had likely felt some caring feelings towards that person. The person has treated them well early on. So thinking of that power and control wheel again, right? That honeymoon period. And also the trafficker learns a lot about them. So this might be even the first time someone's even interested in what they think and what they feel. However, they use what they learn about them against them and in order to keep them, right? So thinking about that fear of safety for themselves or their family. And also there's a potential that they may not know where they are and so not sure how to escape. The impacts of human trafficking, oftentimes we talk about the individual in terms of their physical health, sexual health, even economic, that they may have some diminished economic opportunities, maybe because of their criminal records or their educational deprivation. We also are aware of the impact of trauma and how that impacts a person's worldview, how they view themselves, what they think about their future, how they think about their community. And some things we don't, I don't think we talk enough about is their family, how their family is impacted, that there may be questioning their parenting abilities. There might be some self-blame, might be blaming spouses or partners or other family members. It might impact how they parent the survivor's siblings. Thinking of judgment or worry what other people might think. There might be some system involvement. And the feelings of anger, sadness, guilt, shame, and also knowing that these things impact someone's ability to get help and to talk to others. And of course, there's the intergenerational transference of trauma. There's also the community impact. There is money that's coming in that's not taxed and is impacting communities that are then expected to support the survivors and their families and don't maybe have the structure available to do that. And think about the safety of your community when there are certain communities who are much more impacted by human trafficking, and that would impact just community members' feelings of safety. The legal system has often treated survivors as criminals, and also the traffickers, particularly with young people, they use them to set up some of these dates or rapes, I would call them, because then they can say that they weren't involved, and they know that young people aren't under 18 aren't going to be charged, or they won't have the same amount of time against them. Also, criminal convictions can impact their ability to access housing, government assistance, and employment. I also want to bring your attention to the community and the helpers. So when we're working with survivors of human trafficking, that impacts our feelings of safety. Their trauma reactions may also impact our worldview, our feelings of how helpful we can be to the people we're working with. And so we'll talk a little bit about the importance of self-care, as this is and also under talked about impact of trauma of human trafficking. So January is Human Trafficking Prevention Month. I encourage you to think about what you might be doing in your agencies to bring awareness to human trafficking. I have like 37 big posters that about human trafficking that I'm willing to share if you're in the Waterbury area or even towards West Hartford. And also you can contact the Blue campaign. They can give you lots of different materials for free that they'll ship to you. So let's talk a little bit about prevention. Education is key. With the education about healthy relationships, healthy sexual development, internet safety, and social media safety, as well as educating community members. There's some really interesting movements out there. So there's something called Truckers Against Trafficking, and they've because truck stops are one of the hotspots for trafficking, and so they've trained truckers to identify trafficking and know what to do next. So where they and people have been rescued from truckers recognizing some signs or seeing things that just don't seem right. I recently was at in the Fort Lauderdale airport, and on the overhead I hear what to do if someone's been a victim of trafficking, or if you see something that looks like trafficking. In the bathrooms there were posters. You know, being more aware of this topic, I was more attuned to what was being said on the overhead. I asked my husband and if he heard the overhead, and he had no idea what I was talking about. So, but that is also even in the service industry. So thinking about hotels, those who work for airlines, they've been all trained to identify trafficking, because this really takes an approach for lots of people. This is not something that just one person or one group like CT-HART's collaborative. It really takes all of us together to prevent and also to intervene. I also want to consider some of the other things that are important for prevention. So increasing pro-social activities and supports, building and maintaining healthy relationships and attachments to parents and caregivers, positive connections with families, peers, teachers, coaches, mentors, academic success and achievements, employment opportunities. So how can we help people feel that they are valued, that and also have some feelings of self-efficacy? Those are all really important when we look at some of the vulnerabilities of low self-esteem and self-worth that can that might make somebody more vulnerable. So how can a trusted adult counteract risk factors? So discussing different topics such as healthy relationships, red flags for unhealthy, abusive relationships. I don't know if some of you may have been trained in the Safe Dates curriculum, and that's really important to think about for adolescents. Oftentimes we think of harmful, unhealthy dating relationships as what somebody has as an adult, but oftentimes these relationships start during adolescence. Healthy sexual relationships and consent, safe internet usage, just having some of these conversations in a way that's that doesn't feel like it's lecturing, right? So using opportunities of watching television shows together, you know, and maybe, or even music, right? So Stephanie had mentioned the pimp ho culture, right? So some of you who love 90s hip hop, unfortunately, that was also a time where a lot of the music had been glamorizing that culture. And so using some of that to talk about how you know when someone's taking advantage of you. Let's talk a little bit about intervention. Often a rescue isn't the only or best way to freedom. Training to recognize and respond appropriately to trafficking, as well as trauma-informed spaces to help to heal, help create pathways for more victims to exit exploitation. So we want to offer opportunities for somebody to leave on their own, right? So they were groomed and lured into the life. And what we want to do is empower them to feel that they can make good choices for themselves. Language is really important. Survivors rarely identify with the term being trafficked or even being a survivor or being a victim. They often see their, the person who's trafficking them as their partner rather than a pimp or a trafficker. We want to accept their identified terms and work within that framework. So we're mirroring their language. So being mindful that if we use some of this other stronger language, that it could be a turnoff to them. So some examples of how to talk about trafficking could be many young adolescents living on the street feel scared and find someone to protect and care for them. I wonder whether this is true for you. Some people care so much about their partners that they feel obligated to prove their love and begin doing things they are not really comfortable with. I'm curious whether this has been your experience as well. It's so important to build a relationship before we have some of these conversations, because it may feel, because of the shame and then not maybe also being aware of their experience, it could take some time for them to recognize that these experiences have been problematic. Other assessment questions include, have you ever been traded or been asked to trade sex or sexual acts for food, shelter, or other basic needs? Does someone control, supervise, or monitor what you do? And we can think about, maybe we're noticing some things and we might say, oh, are they always checking your messages? Do they always go with you to your appointments? Thinking about that. And there's also been some other really interesting and ways that people have tried to get people alone to talk about their experience. So maybe it's saying, oh, okay, we need to do a urine tox screen. So it's a way to get some privacy and to talk about some of these things or ask some of these really important questions. So if the indicators or assessment questions lead you to suspect trafficking or exploitation, calling 911 is vital if it's an emergency. So if you feel that the person is in need of police intervention, where you might see some abuse in the community, or you see that there's maybe a situation that doesn't look right. Maybe someone's in a car and they look scared. So calling 911 in an emergency. The CT HART will also suggest calling DCF care line. So when you call the care line, it may, and this is with young people, they may not accept the call, but that doesn't mean that work is happening. So calling the care line can also kick off some other important folks to address the problem. So again, if you're a mandated reporter, you're required to call the care line, but I do want you to know that if it's not accepted, it doesn't mean that nothing's happening or it's been ignored. However, if you call the care line about trafficking, it's so important to be specific and detailed in using the words human trafficking. They have been trained for those calls to go through a separate channel so that they're properly addressed by the teams. When we're accessing help for an adult, calling 911 in an urgent situation. You may also want to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I don't know if anyone's ever called them. They remind me of like calling 211 and Careline, that they are mandated reporters. So if someone's under the age, they also may call the Careline. But they give you resources in your community of where you can get additional information to support the person you're working with. So they're really good resource in terms of working through understanding what to do next, or getting more information about what's available in your area. The Be Free text line is also active, and they've learned that text seems to be the safest mode of communication for those who have been trafficked. And it also provides some help when they, when maybe they want to plan their escape, or if they need services in their area. So many of you probably doing a lot of safety planning, right? So some of you may use the Brown safety plan, or you have some sort of safety plan that you're using. This is also really key with working with survivors of human trafficking. We want to make sure that we're transparent, right? People that they've worked with have may not always been transparent, so letting them know what can be confidential, what we may have to disclose. We want to make sure that we're being supportive and not punitive. So making sure that there's not like threats of not being able to engage in services, and also thinking about how do we reconnect them with their family. Oftentimes, survivors may return to their families, but there's not enough attention to how to help them reconnect and create that feeling of safety and security that we know is so important in families. Engaging fathers is critical. I've worked with a young person whose father wasn't very involved in the treatment, but he was really helpful in understanding what happened to his daughter. And he was also someone who was very available to her, and she felt supported by him. So thinking about making sure that we are engaging them, that they are also a very important part of this process of support. And then we'll talk a little bit about psychoeducation and risk reduction, trauma-informed therapy in a bit. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, have been trained in trauma-informed care, right? So that's moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And so we want to be particularly mindful of trauma-informed care when working with victims of trafficking. So being mindful of the value of providing options, of empowering, of peer support, of being transparent, of being non-judgmental, of those routines and rituals that we may use in our work, whether it's group therapy, individual therapy, or family therapy. So what I want you to keep in mind is a mental health worker may become the first non-transactional relationship they've had since early childhood. So being mindful of this will help us recognize why we might be experiencing some pushback when we're trying to engage, or when maybe we are not being seen as genuine, that they're not used to these relationships, and that it's going to take a long time for them to see that we're not looking for something in return. And we also have to be very mindful that we don't ask for anything in return. So we are letting them lead the way in the work. I also want to highlight that it's important to not expect the person to believe their situation is unhealthy or abusive, that we are just being open and listening and trying to understand their experience through their eyes. So there are various coping mechanisms that make it difficult to identify and assist victims. they're not identifying as victims. There might be a lot of shame or self-blame, feelings of unworthiness for a better life. There's some bonding to the trafficker. Again, they've really built these relationships very intensely and learned a lot about them very quickly and provided maybe some needed assistance early on that the person may feel that they have to be loyal to them. There might be some normalization of exploitation or minimizing of their experiences, substance use, deflection and defense mechanisms. Again, there may be very guarded, and when we are thinking that we're offering compliments or affirmations, that these may be rejected by them. And it's important for us to recognize that this is because of their view of relationships have been drastically impacted, and our relationship with survivors of human trafficking is just so important for us to be mindful that this hopefully can create a new blueprint of what they can expect in relationships moving forward. Avoidance of trauma triggers, so it might be people, places, certain topics. They may dissociate. There might be suicidal ideation or risk-taking behaviors, self-harm, agitation or outbursts, fear and distrust of law enforcement and government services, as well as fear for their own safety and the safety of loved ones. So being mindful of these coping mechanisms and viewing them as coping mechanisms. So it's really on us to be experts on complex trauma. So when a behavior arises, it's important for us to ask ourselves, is this about fear in relationships? Is this about overwhelming emotions? Is this about difficulty thinking? Is this about an out of balance body? Is this about shame? And when we ask these questions, it might give us a clue of where to move forward next. So I invite you, when you see some of these challenging behaviors that impact our therapeutic alliance, that you're also thinking about, like, what is going on for them? Why might I be seeing this reaction? And that can help us think about what is it that we need to do more of, right? Do we need to teach more about how to manage distress? Do we need to teach more emotion regulation skills? Do we need to help with maybe do some more cognitive therapy, thinking of their labels and how they view themselves, their world, and others? In terms of fear in relationships, maybe we need to make sure that they have more opportunities of being valued and cared for in their relationships in a healthy way. Some of this may seem really basic. I personally don't think we spend enough time talking about some of these early skills we learned as clinicians. They're so valuable in the work. I know we spend a lot of time thinking about evidence-based therapies. There really aren't any evidence-based therapies that have been shown to be the most effective with people who have been trafficked. However, we do know that our trauma-informed therapies are very helpful, but and all of them involve some of these basic skills we learned in our early education about how to do therapy. So it's these active listening skills, facial expressions, our body language, and then the unconditional positive regard. Does anyone want to share something that you feel really shameful about with someone who you think is judging you? So being so mindful that that accepting them for where they are, allowing them to come and go from the therapeutic relationship, and so sometimes our systems don't allow for that, but that is so key with people who have been trafficked. And making sure that we're authentic, so being ourselves. So, and when we're doing therapy, it's thinking about, okay, so what is genuine for me? How do I show people that they feel that they're invited for therapy, that they're welcomed, that I am not going to judge them for anything that they've shared, that I'm listening to them. So Carl Rogers, right? He's the father of unconditional positive regard. And he said, we think we listen, but we very rarely do. We listen with real understanding, true empathy, yet listening of this very special kind is one of the most potent forces for change that I know. When someone really hears you without passing judgment on you, without trying to take responsibility for you, without trying to mold you, it feels damn good. So working on some of those reflective listening skills, and there's so many really great evidence-based treatments that focus on that. And one I'm thinking about in particular is motivational interviewing, where you're practicing a lot of these reflective skills and meeting the person where they're at. Oftentimes someone's presenting to us and they're not interested in therapy. And what they really need are some of these really basic resources, such as housing, food, water, shelter, medicine. And that's what they need in the moment, and being mindful that when, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we don't have our physiological needs met, if we don't feel safe and secure, we're not going to be able to work on those other needs, such as love and belonging, a sense of connection, our confidence, achievement. So being mindful that those physiological needs may need to be met first, and that might involve partnering with other systems. When we're working with survivors of human trafficking, it's not something that we can just do alone. Safety planning, again, it's really important, and that's should be, when we're doing safety planning, remembering it's a live document and it's not something that's just done once. It's something we continue to do and discuss together. Having a collaborative relationship, survivors need to know that there's someone who cares for them and will listen carefully. Also being predictable and letting them know that they have control over their own healing, providing lots of choices and empowering them. So some of you may be familiar with ARC, right? Attachment, self-regulation, and competency. And I think this is just such a nice framework to think about the work that's needed to be done, right? So working on engagement, providing psychoeducation about sex trafficking, how people are groomed, what are healthy relationships, and creating routines and rhythms. So people feel safe when there are routines and there's predictability. And also recognizing that modulation might be where we start, right? So ARC doesn't necessarily start at the bottom row, that maybe we're moving straight to how do you manage these really overwhelming emotions? And then we can continue to work on on psychoeducation. Treatment goals, these are some ideas of what the person might be interested in working on. So these are just ideas, and again, we want them to choose what would be what they're interested in working on. We might want to assess the stage of change that they're in. When survivors are in pre-contemplation, they may respond positively to increasing education and awareness. If they're in contemplation, that they may benefit from looking at costs and benefit analyses. And again, we know that with stages of change, they can change. Someone moves through, can go back to pre-contemplation, then move to action. So being mindful of where they're at and meeting them there. Trauma treatment, cognitive behavioral therapies can be helpful. Again, some of the other therapies that have been helpful are DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, EMDR, trauma-focused CBT. Actually, there's a trauma-focused CBT created this free manual online for survivors of human trafficking. So I encourage you to look at that they have made that available for people working with children who have been victims, and how to modify trauma-focused CBT for that particular population. Creative interventions are really important to build resiliency, including creativity, humor, flexibility, movement, and then also thinking about how grief might be involved, and feelings of anxiety, guilt, shame. So helping people to shift their perspective and reframe. Art therapy, music, journaling, poetry, songwriting, trauma-sensitive yoga. So with trauma-sensitive yoga, it's changing the language, inviting people to get into certain poses. So you're giving choices throughout. Someone can stay in child pose the whole time, but you can invite them to try some new things, and also certain postures in yoga might be avoided when doing trauma-sensitive yoga. Body work, drama, equine therapy, outdoor physical activities. This is where we might think about boys. One thing I do want to note is that it's very difficult to find treatment for boys. Unfortunately, there's really very little information because they are often under recognized that a lot of our treatments have been focused on girls or youth who identify as female. Group counseling can be helpful to empower and provide a sense of community and support. It's also crucial in bearing witness to similar lived experiences. So that's that sense of universality, that they're not alone, that others have experienced what they've experienced. Shame promotes secrecy, and individuals can be most comfortable with peers who understand and have lived their own struggles. So thinking about how to utilize peer-led services and to engage peers to support each other. You may have heard of some of these prevention curricula. So Not a Number is very popular. It's from Love 146, and In My Life, My Choice is another one. So with Not a Number, they say that all genders are, that their curriculum is good for all genders. In terms of My Life, My Choice, they say it's most frequently been studied with youth who are female or identify as female. These are prevention curricula. And then there's Ending the Game, which is a curriculum for victims of commercial sexual exploitation. And actually that curriculum also says it's most frequently been reviewed with females. So you can see that there is, it's lacking what's available for working with boys. When we think about trauma-informed care, I want to bring your attention to a few things. So safety, right? We've talked a lot about that. Trustworthiness and transparency. So we're building relationships. We're building trust. We are being transparent. We are addressing challenges in our interactions, providing peer support, collaboration, empowerment, always focusing on giving the survivor opportunities to share their voice and to give them choices. And here I want to talk a little bit about cultural responsiveness. So being mindful of socio-political experiences that people have had and how that impacts their experience of being trafficked, of the services that they've received. Some of you may have heard of the documentary, The Color of Justice, that talked about Connecticut's juvenile justice system and the disparities that occur throughout that whole system. So thinking about how historical trauma and that it's really valuable to consider traditional cultural connections in our work. I'm just going to bring you back to the attachment, self-regulation, and competency framework. So looking at the caregiver affect management, it's so important for us to care for ourselves so that we can provide our best selves for the people that we're working with. It's not selfish to refill your own cup so that you can pour into others. It's not just a luxury, it is essential. I think with the pandemic, everything has just felt so much harder. And so I think it also takes so much more work for us to make sure that we're caring for ourselves, that we're taking time for ourselves, and that we're very mindful when we're struggling. And I just want to warn you that when we are feeling numb, we don't know when we're doing harm. So it's so important for us to be mindful of where we're at, what we need, and how do we get those needs addressed. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. Sometimes we think, oh, well, I've been doing this work for years. I've seen it all. The thing is that it impacts us. Sometimes even just seeing all the terrible things that are happening in the world, in our communities, that those all impact us, and recognizing that there's a cumulative effect that occurs when we are continuing to be immersed in suffering and loss daily, and that we are responsible for counteracting that within ourselves, within our organizations, our coworkers, and our supervisees. There are some signs of burnout: headaches, muscle tension, trouble with sleep, feeling overwhelmed, maybe cynical, maybe feeling a little jaded, frustrated, unfulfilled, irritable. Maybe we find that we're losing our temper a bit more, feeling depleted. Maybe Sunday night blues turn into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday blues. So thinking about how we are, what are our responses and how that might be impacting the work that we're doing. Helpers need support. Working in helping professions can be difficult, draining, and frustrating. I'm sure you've seen very similar pictures where you need to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you can help someone else, because if we are not caring for ourselves, we're not going to be there for others. I invite you to take a look at this mental health self-care wheel and think about different areas of your life that may need to be attended to. So maybe it's maybe you find yourself that you're working through your lunch break. Maybe you work from home and it's hard to get away from the computer, or maybe you're at work and it's feel that there's so much to do that it's hard to walk away to enjoy your lunch. Making sure that we're leaving work at work. How do we do that? Is there some sort of routine you can do so that you can switch from work to home? Take mental health holidays, learning to say no, using your vacation time, setting boundaries. Maybe we're working on our physical, so making sure that we're attending to our medical care, eating healthy, getting a massage. I know some of these sound so lovely, and some of them may feel like, how am I going to have time for that? I don't have time to exercise. But when you're thinking about these, I want you to find something that you really enjoy doing that actually doesn't feel like a burden to involve in your life, right? So maybe it's you like to have some tea, like you take 5 minutes to enjoy a cup of tea. Maybe you have your favorite show that you like to watch, and so making time that you can sit and attend to it. Taking time for self-reflection, keeping a journal, joining a support group, being creative. Some of you may be thinking of holiday lists and maybe some hobbies or some creative activities could be added to your list so you can make sure that you engage in them following the holidays. This can also be a quite stressful time for us and for the people we're working with. So being mindful of, being gentle with ourselves and with others. Practicing self-love, having a good cry, having a good laugh. If you have pets, cuddling with them, and practicing forgiveness, doing singing or dancing, yoga. I know it was a little bit of a rough drive home and I was a little stressed coming in, and I walked into a dance party with my toddler. And so that actually really helped me switch and feel, much more happy and connected. And of course we had to listen to the same song 8 million times, but that was fine. And maybe it's reading a book, finding time for friends, around the holidays is also a great time to meet up with folks, doing things that make you feel special. So again, I just want to thank the Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team for their trainings, and I encourage you to think about maybe connecting with them to do trainings moving forward for your organizations. For many of professionals in Connecticut, their introduction to child trafficking in Connecticut is a requirement. I understand that many of you had done this with Stephanie and Marnie previously, so that's why we did this additional training that looked a little bit more at some of the clinical work. And these are some resources to consider. And then I just wanted to, Love 146 has some really great videos. Their chief chief of programs and policy officer had done a video with her husband, who's a pediatrician at Yale. And they talked about the struggles with creating, trying to work on how to make their family and their life at home much more internet safe. And her husband's quite techie, and then of course she has her experience working for Love 146, and just how challenging it is, and it's challenging for them. So imagine what it's like for some of the people that we're working with. But they have this really lovely video talking about how they've navigated some of that and that they're still learning. So I invite you to take a look at that as well. Okay.